My name is Elena Brooks. I'm 33 years old, and I live in Colorado. The night this story truly began, I walked into a family gathering in Colorado Springs, carrying a small envelope in my coat pocket. Already knowing I wasn't there to celebrate anything, I scanned the room once, then again, and realized every chair had a name card except mine. Before I could ask, my mother Diane looked straight at me and said there wasn't a seat set aside for distractions. I didn't argue, because arguing had never earned me a place anywhere in that family. I asked quietly where I was supposed to sit, and she answered just as quietly that I could stand in the back until things settled. My sister Madeline didn't look up from her conversation, and my father Robert avoided my eyes as if silence might smooth this over. I stood there holding my purse, listening to the hum of voices that flowed easily around me without ever touching me. What made it worse was how deliberate it felt, how nothing about it was rushed or accidental. The printed name cards were evenly spaced, the extra chairs stacked neatly against the wall, the room arranged to make one absence unmistakable. When I said, "You didn't forget me," my mother replied, "This isn't the time for drama," and turned her back. That was when I felt the envelope press harder against my ribs, as if it had its own pulse. I hadn't brought it to threaten anyone, and I hadn't come looking for sympathy. I brought it because 6 months earlier, a lawyer in Denver told me it contained something my grandmother Ruth believed I deserved to know, and because standing there without a chair finally made the reason unavoidable. As people began taking their seats, I stayed where I was, invisible but awake. Counting how many years I had learned to swallow moments like this, I remember thinking that if I stayed quiet again, nothing would change. And if I spoke, everything would. I took a breath, stepped forward, and said my father's name out loud, steady enough that the room fell silent. I told him I understood why there was no place for me tonight, and that I finally understood why it had always been that way. When I reached into my coat and felt the edge of the envelope, I knew this was the last time I would stand in the back of a room pretending I belonged. 6 months earlier, I had been sitting across from Michael O'Rourke in his Denver office, listening to him explain why my grandmother's final request hadn't been handled with the rest of her estate. He told me, calmly and without embellishment, that Ruth had opened a separate safe deposit box years before she died and left explicit written instructions that its contents were not to be released immediately. When I asked what was inside, he said only, "She wanted you to have time before you saw it," and slid a thin folder across the desk without opening it. I remember saying, "Time for what?" And him answering, "For the truth to land without destroying you." He explained that the box could not be accessed until 6 months after her death. Not by my mother, not by my sister, and not even by him without proper identification. I asked if anyone else had tried to claim it, and he met my eyes and said, "They asked," then added, "They were denied." When I pressed him on why Ruth would go to such lengths, he said she had insisted the contents were personal, not financial, and that they belonged to me alone. I signed the release forms with a hand that felt steady, even though my chest was tight. Before I left, Michael paused and told me there was also a letter, handwritten, sealed separately, and addressed only to me. He said she had written that the delay was intentional, that she didn't want me opening it while I was surrounded by people who might try to control the narrative. I asked him if he knew what was in it, and he shook his head and said, "I was instructed not to know," as if ignorance itself had been part of the protection. That was the moment I realized my grandmother hadn't been vague or sentimental. She had been precise. I didn't open anything that day, or the week after, or the month after that. The envelope sat untouched in my apartment while life kept moving. Phone calls stayed short, and no one in my family mentioned Ruth unless it was convenient. Sometimes I would take it out, feel the weight of it, and put it back, telling myself I wasn't ready yet. Other times I wondered if readiness was just another excuse I had learned to survive. Standing in that room in Colorado Springs, with no chair and no invitation to belong, the memory of Michael's voice came back to me with unexpected clarity. He had said, "She wanted you to have this when you finally stopped asking for permission." And at the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now, with my parents' silence echoing around me, I did. The envelope in my coat wasn't a threat or a demand. It was a receipt, and I was finally ready to hand it over. The pattern didn't announce itself all at once. It revealed itself through repetition, through who was asked to step forward and who was quietly pushed back. When my mother was diagnosed and the room filled with talk of schedules and sacrifices, my father looked at me and said, "You're the flexible one," while my sister Madeline stared at the table as if the question had never been meant for her. I said I could take a leave from work and help, and my mother nodded like this had already been decided. No one asked what it would cost me, only whether I would cooperate. Weeks turned into months, and every decision followed the same logic dressed up as practicality. When Madeline's hospital rotation conflicted with family needs, my mother said, "Her career can't be interrupted." And when my own hours were cut back, she told me, "You'll manage. You always do." I remember asking once if I could return to school later, and my father replied, "Be realistic." Like ambition was something I'd already spent. The word realistic became their way of saying no without admitting they'd already chosen. It wasn't just the big moments. It was the small ones that taught me where I stood. At family dinners, Madeline's updates were met with questions and praise, while mine were acknowledged with, "That's nice." Before the conversation moved on, if I spoke too long, my mother would interrupt with, "Let's not dwell." And if I went quiet, she'd tell relatives, "Elena's just sensitive." Every version of me was wrong, but useful enough to keep around. Money followed the same script, even when no one said it out loud. Tuition checks were written without discussion, while my expenses were framed as favors. And when I once mentioned struggling with rent, my father said, "You chose independence," as if choice and necessity were the same thing. I learned to stop asking before the answer embarrassed me. It was easier to be dependable than to be seen. By the time I stood in that room without a chair, none of this felt new, only clearer. The same people who told me I was difficult had relied on me whenever something needed to be handled quietly. The same family that praised Madeline's drive called my endurance a lack of direction. Standing there, I understood that the injustice wasn't accidental or temporary. It was a structure I'd been placed inside long before I knew how to name it. The will was read 2 months after Ruth's funeral, in a quiet office where my mother sat upright and composed. My sister Madeline held her breath, and my father kept his hands folded as if the outcome were already settled. Michael O'Rourke read each line without emphasis, naming the house to my mother, the investment accounts to Madeline, and the remainder of the estate divided cleanly and efficiently. When he reached my name, he paused just long enough to say, "I was left several personal items of sentimental value." My mother exhaled and said, "That sounds like her," as if affection explained the imbalance. I nodded and kept my face neutral while the list continued. A set of first edition books, handwritten notes, and a small collection of letters Ruth had kept for decades. Madeline smiled and whispered, "That's actually really sweet." And my father added, "She always had a soft spot for you." No one mentioned money, because money had already gone where it was expected to go. I thanked Michael and said I understood, which was true in a way that surprised me. What didn't fit was what came next. When Michael closed the folder and said there was one more matter not addressed in the will itself, he explained that Ruth had created a separate instruction, legally distinct, and that its contents were not part of the estate being discussed. My mother stiffened and asked, "What contents?" And he replied evenly, "They aren't available yet." The room shifted. Subtle but unmistakable. Michael clarified that this separate item was designated for me alone and could not be released until a specific waiting period had passed. My father frowned and asked if there was a mistake. And Michael said, "No. This was intentional." Madeline looked at me with curiosity she didn't try to hide. And my mother said nothing at all. I realized then that whatever Ruth had left me was not meant to balance the scales, but to explain why they had never been level. I opened the envelope alone in my apartment after the waiting period ended. Sitting at the same kitchen table where I paid bills and ate standing up when I was too tired to cook. The seal broke cleanly. And inside I found a handwritten letter from Ruth. A lab report folded twice. And a copy of a birth record with one section deliberately blacked out. I read the letter first because it felt like the only human thing in the stack. And the first line said, "Elena, I'm sorry I waited this long." By the time I reached the end of the page, my hands were steady in a way my breathing was not. Ruth wrote that she had watched my mother punish me for something that was never my fault. And that silence had started to feel like another form of harm. She explained that she had arranged private testing after noticing details she couldn't ignore, and that she had kept records because she knew facts were harder to dismiss than feelings. When I read, "You are not Robert's biological daughter," the sentence didn't explode. It settled, like something heavy finally landing where it belonged. I said out loud, "That explains it," and surprised myself by how calm it sounded. The lab report was clinical and precise, stamped and signed, listing a probability of paternity at 0%. I read it 3 times, not because I doubted it, but because numbers have a way of demanding attention even when your mind resists. The birth record underneath showed my name, my mother's, and a blacked-out line where a father's name should have been. As intentional as any omission I'd ever lived with. Seeing that dark block of ink felt less like a mystery and more like confirmation. I sat there for a long time without moving. The room quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator kick on and off. Memories rearranged themselves without asking permission. Every moment of distance suddenly finding a reason. When my mother had said I was difficult. When my father had said I wasn't practical. When Madeline had been chosen without discussion. It all lined up with unsettling clarity. I didn't feel rage yet. Just recognition. By the time I put the papers back into the envelope, I knew I wouldn't pretend anymore that the imbalance was imagined. Ruth hadn't given me money or leverage. She had given me proof. She had written, "Truth doesn't fix everything, but it gives you solid ground." And I finally understood what she meant. I slid the envelope into my bag, knowing that the next time I took it out, it wouldn't be in private. I met my Aunt Janice 2 days later at her kitchen table. And before I could sit down, she said, "You opened it, didn't you?" Like she already knew the answer. I told her I had. And that the report said 0%. And she didn't ask to see it. Only nodded and said, "That's what Ruth expected." When I asked how long she'd known, she looked at me carefully and said, "Long enough to be sure. Not long enough to stop what was happening." The way she said happening made it sound ongoing. Not finished. She told me Ruth had asked for her help because facts were easier to protect than suspicions. And because Janice understood records and procedure, she didn't want gossip. She wanted proof. Janice said, tapping the table once for emphasis. And she didn't trust anyone else to keep it clean. I asked if my mother knew. And Janice replied, she knew Ruth suspected. And she panicked. Then added, "Fear makes people double down." Hearing that didn't shock me. It clarified something I'd lived with. When I asked how the samples were taken, Janice didn't hesitate. She said, hair from a brush, a glass from dinner, nothing dramatic. And then, everything documented. I said it felt surreal. And she answered, it should. Because the lie lasted longer than the truth ever had a chance to. She told me Ruth wanted me to have something undeniable, not a story that could be argued away. I noticed she never used my mother's name while she spoke. I asked if anyone else knew. And Janice said, only me and Ruth. Then corrected herself with, now you. She warned me that once the information was public, control would shift fast, and that my mother would try to reframe it. She's good at that, Janice said. She's had practice. And I believed her. When I asked what Ruth wanted me to do, Janice looked almost relieved. She wanted you to stop questioning your worth, Janice said, then paused and added, and to stop protecting people who never protected you. I told her I wasn't sure I was ready to confront anyone. And she replied, ready isn't the same as obligated. Before I left, she said, whatever you decide, don't let them tell you this was a misunderstanding. And I promised her I wouldn't. Walking away, I realized this was the first conversation about my life where no one asked me to be smaller. The confrontation didn't happen at a holiday table, but at my father Robert's retirement reception, held in a rented community hall with folding chairs and a banner that said congratulations, like it was a fact no one questioned. People from his office filled the room, shaking his hand, telling him he'd earned his rest, while my mother Diane smiled beside him like a practiced reflex. I waited until the speeches ended and the crowd settled, then walked up and said, Dad, before you leave, there's something you need to hear. He looked surprised, then uneasy, and said, Elena, not now. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, now is the only time, and held out the envelope so he couldn't pretend it wasn't there. Diane stepped in immediately and said, this isn't appropriate. Like appropriateness had ever protected me. And I replied, you decided what was appropriate for 33 years. Robert took the envelope from my hand, slower than necessary, and asked, what is this? As if the weight didn't already tell him, I said, it's the reason you never looked at me like your daughter. He opened it in front of everyone, pulling out the report with hands that had signed off on thousands of claims without shaking. Someone laughed nearby, not realizing what was happening, and Robert read silently until his face drained of color. Diane whispered, Robert, don't. But he didn't look at her. He looked at me and said, this says 0%. I answered, it says you aren't my biological father. And the room went quiet enough to hear chairs shift. Madeline stepped closer and said, this can't be real. And I told her, it's stamped, signed, and verified. Because facts mattered now. Diane started crying loudly, saying, you're humiliating us. And I said, you humiliated me privately for decades, Robert asked, barely audible. How long have you known? And I said, since Ruth made sure I could prove it. He closed his eyes like the math had finally caught up. Diane tried to take the papers from him, saying, this is a misunderstanding. And he pulled them back and said, no, it isn't. He looked at me then, really looked, and said, I suspected when you were little. And the words hit harder than the report ever could. I asked, how little? And he said, 5, maybe 6. Like the number was an apology. I said, so you knew. And he nodded once. Someone behind us murmured, is this true? And Robert answered before Diane could, saying, yes. She stared at him like he'd betrayed her. And he said, I betrayed her first. Meaning me. Though he didn't say my name, Madeline started crying, saying, This is ruining everything. And I said, It already did. You just weren't the one paying for it. No one argued with that. Diane tried again, saying, I made one mistake. And I said, You made it my life. Robert asked me quietly, Why now? And I told him, Because you're done working and I'm done waiting. He nodded like that made sense. Because it did. The truth didn't need a holiday. It needed witnesses. I didn't wait for permission to leave. I just said, I wanted you to hear it from me. And stepped back. Robert didn't stop me. And Diane didn't follow. Because there was nothing left to control. As I walked out, I heard Robert tell someone, We need to talk later. And for the first time, I knew that later didn't belong to me anymore. I had said what I came to say. And the room could keep the rest. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments through messages, missed calls, and conversations that stopped when I entered a room. 2 days after the reception, my father called and said, Your mother and I are taking some space. And when I asked what that meant, he replied, It means things are changing whether we like it or not. My mother left a voicemail telling me I'd embarrassed her in front of people who mattered. And I didn't call back. Silence, for once, wasn't something I owed anyone. Madeline reached out next, her voice shaking as she said, I don't know how to fix this. And I told her, It was never yours to fix. She asked if we were still sisters. And I said, We grew up in the same house. That's all I can promise right now. She cried, not quietly, and said everything felt unstable. And I realized how unfamiliar that feeling was for her. For the first time, she was standing where I'd lived most of my life. Family opinions split quickly, not along lines of right and wrong, but along comfort. Some relatives avoided me entirely, while others said things like, We always wondered, or It makes sense now. As if clarity required distance. My Aunt Janice told me, Your mother is trying to rewrite it already. And I answered, She can try. Because the paper trail didn't care. Facts, once released, didn't ask permission to exist. My father asked to meet. And when we sat across from each other, he said, I don't expect forgiveness. Which was the first honest sentence I'd heard from him in years. I told him I wasn't interested in punishing anyone, only in not carrying their choices anymore. He nodded and said, I failed you. Without qualifiers. And that mattered more than apologies ever had. We parted without resolution, but with something closer to truth. What surprised me most was the quiet that followed. No one told me what to do next. No one asked me to soften it or make it easier for them. The story had escaped my mother's control. And without that pressure, I felt space open up around me. I hadn't won anything, but I hadn't lost myself either. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The name came to me quietly. Not as an answer, but as a direction. The investigator confirmed that my biological father was Thomas Reed. Retired. Living in Oregon. And when she said it, she added, He doesn't know about you. Like that fact mattered as much as the name itself. I thanked her and asked for nothing else. Because knowing where to look felt different from knowing what to say. That night I sat with the envelope closed on the table and tried to imagine a man who had lived a full life without realizing I existed. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and the message preview stopped just short of saying too much. It read, Hello, Elena. I was told you might be looking for me. And I didn't open it right away. I could hear Janice's voice in my head saying, You don't owe immediacy to anyone. And for once I listened. I set the phone face down and finished what I was doing, just to prove I could. When I finally read the message, it was careful, almost formal, saying he'd recently learned something unexpected and wanted to know if I was open to talking. He wrote, "I don't know what you've been told, and I don't want to cause harm," which felt sincere without being dramatic. I typed and erased 3 different replies before saving nothing at all. Silence wasn't fear this time. It was choice. I thought about the men who had shaped my life by presence and absence, and how neither role guaranteed anything. Robert had been there and still failed me, and Thomas had been nowhere and might still disappoint. The difference now was that I wasn't building my worth around either outcome. I wasn't looking for replacement or repair. Just clarity. I left the message unanswered and went to bed. Not because I was avoiding the truth, but because I wanted to meet it rested. The story that began with a missing chair had given me something solid to stand on, even without knowing what came next. Tomorrow or next week I would respond, or I wouldn't. And either way, the choice would be mine. The open space ahead didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for the parts that were hard to say out loud. If any part of it felt familiar, I hope it reminded you that you're allowed to choose honesty. Even when it's uncomfortable, feel free to share your thoughts if you want. And take whatever helps you move forward. Wherever you are, I hope you find steadiness, peace, and room to be fully yourself.